I can still remember the smell of cold, wet earth that clung to my coat that night. The year was 1841, and I was guiding a small stagecoach through the remote frontier roads of England's northern countryside. The paths were little more than rutted trails, scarcely trodden by man, and yet, despite the isolation, there was something unnatural in the air, a weight pressing upon my chest, the kind that made your own heartbeat sound like a distant drum in a graveyard. I first noticed it as we crested the hill just beyond old WRM's Ford. The horses, strong beasts, trained for endurance, began to hesitate. Their hooves faltered in the mud, ears swiveling, nostrils flaring. I paused, urging them forward with a light whip, but the sound seemed to vanish into the dark woods on either side. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, echoing faintly among the skeletal trees. I dismissed it at first, blaming foxes or stray dogs, yet a cold shiver ran down my spine. It was not a sound of the living. It was deeper, resonant, and intelligent. By the time we reached the hollow where the old tavern once stood, abandoned now for years, the wind had changed. It carried a tang of sulfur and something fouler, a rotting scent that pricked at the back of my throat. I glanced at my companion, Thomas, seated beside me in the driver's box, and he, too, looked uneasy, though he pretended otherwise. His jaw was tight, eyes scanning the darkened woods. We had both heard the stories, the warnings of the old stage drivers who swore that ghostly hounds haunted the frontier roads. But superstition had never gripped me before this night. Now it seemed the tales were real. The first sign came in the form of footprints. Not human, and certainly not of any known dog breed. Large paw prints pressed into the soft mud, each one perfectly formed yet impossibly wide. They did not belong to any creature I had ever seen or read of. I traced them with my eyes, trying to calculate their pace. They moved along the edge of the road, paralleling our path, as if watching, calculating. I felt an inexplicable urge to quicken our pace, but the horses, sensitive to the unseen, refused to move faster. I told Thomas to keep his eyes forward. "It's only the wind," I said, though my own voice sounded brittle in the cold night. The truth was, I had no words for what I felt, a creeping dread that slithered over the bones beneath my skin. The road ahead disappeared into darkness, framed by twisted, leafless trees whose limbs clawed at the sky. Every shadow seemed alive, stretching and contracting with a mind of its own. Even the stars appeared dim, swallowed by a mist that rolled in like a silent tide. We rode for hours, though it could have been minutes. Time lost meaning in that place. And then I heard it again, a sound behind us, soft at first, then growing in confidence. A rhythmic padding, deliberate, measured, too precise to belong to mere animals. Thomas's knuckles whitened on the reins. The horses snorted nervously, their ears flat against their heads. My stomach clenched as I realized that whatever followed us was keeping pace without effort, without hesitation. It was studying us, waiting for an opportunity. I dared not look back. Part of me wanted to confront the source of that intelligent menace, yet instinct screamed against it. Stories of spectral hounds weren't merely old wives' tales. They carried warnings of doom for those who mocked or ignored them. We had trespassed into something old, something that lingered on the edges of this world and the next. Each step of our horses over frozen mud echoed unervingly against the darkness, a fragile heartbeat in the void. By midnight, the fog thickened. It clung to our faces, muffled sound, and twisted the familiar into something alien. Shapes moved at the edges of my vision, dark, elongated forms that vanished when I tried to focus. The smell of sulfur grew stronger, acrid and choking. And then a howl split the night, a high, keening sound that rattled the marrow in my bones. Not one, but many, layered in unnatural harmony. The hounds were there. I felt their presence pressing from every side, yet I could see nothing beyond the fog and trees. Thomas whispered a prayer under his breath. I gripped the reins, trying to steady the horses, but the beasts trembled beneath me. Every instinct screamed that we should stop, turn, flee, but the road offered no sanctuary, only deeper shadows. Something was watching, waiting for us to falter. I wrote these words in the hope that someone might understand what we faced. Not beasts of flesh alone, but spirits or curses that had lingered along these roads for generations. Roads that had once carried travelers safely to the frontier, now a corridor for the hunted. By the time we reached the first stone bridge past the ford, I dared to glance behind. Two glowing eyes reflected in the fog. Low to ground, unmoving yet unmistakably alive. Then a third, then a fourth. Shapes, hulking, spectral, hounds of legend. Lurched forward, their movements impossibly swift and silent. My heart lurched into my throat. That moment, I realized we were no longer drivers on a familiar road. We were prey, stumbling blindly into a night that remembered ancient grievances and demanded payment in fear. I do not know how we survived that first encounter, or if survival was even granted by mercy or sheer luck. What I know is that the road changed us. The air itself seemed charged with malevolence. We had trespassed where no man was meant to tread, and yet the hounds did not strike immediately. They lingered, testing, shaping the terror. And that, I suppose, was the true horror, not merely the sight of them, but the knowledge that something so old and cunning regarded us as part of its game. The roads of 1841 were not like those of bustling towns, or even the larger country lanes. Here, in the northern frontier, they were little more than dirt tracks worn into the land by countless wheels and hoofs over decades. Forests pressing on either side, and in the deep winter, the cold was a living thing, sharp and unrelenting, cutting through the layers of wool and leather as if it could reach the bones themselves. I had traveled many such routes before, carrying letters, parcels, and the occasional passenger from one village to the next, but nothing had prepared me for what lay ahead. My companion, Thomas, had been a driver like myself for years. Broad-shouldered and steady, he rarely showed fear, yet tonight he was different. The usual stoicism in his eyes had given way to something tentative, as though the darkness itself had begun to crawl into his mind. "I've heard tell," he murmured once, just before he left the bridge, "of the roads where travelers vanish never to be seen again. Ghosts, they say, cursed beasts that hunt in packs. Old stories to frighten children, perhaps, but still, his voice trailed off, swallowed by the fog. I did not respond. Words felt useless in the presence of something beyond comprehension. Our stagecoach, a rickety wooden box on wheels, drawn by two weary horses, creaked with every bump and rut. Inside, the cargo was meager, letters, small parcels, and a barrel of salted meat intended for a settlement miles ahead. There were no inns or outposts for a dozen miles. Once we left the main road, there would be nothing but the trail, the trees, and the darkness that seemed to pulse like a living heart. The cold was not merely an absence of warmth. It carried a texture. It pricked at exposed skin, made our breath visible in thick clouds, and clung to the reins in frost-encrusted stiffness. The horse's breath came in white puffs, mingling with the mist that rose from the marshes alongside the road. Occasionally, the wind carried a whisper, too soft to discern his words, yet persistent, curling around our ears. The silence between these sounds was no less menacing. In fact, it seemed amplified, stretching long moments into eternity. Every creak of the wheels, every snap of a twig, sounded like a proclamation of our presence. We passed abandoned farmhouses, their roofs caved, windows darkened, and doors hanging from broken hinges. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys, but the scent of rot lingered, mingling with damp earth. There were signs that people had fled in haste. Pots overturned, tools scattered, and clothing left to rot in the mud. My stomach churned. Even if this was mere misfortune, the isolation was profound. And isolation, I have learned, is a fertile ground for fear. Thomas, to his credit, kept the horses moving. We spoke little. Words felt inadequate. Yet we shared glances, the unspoken acknowledgement of danger weaving between us like the reins we clutched. At one point, I spotted something in the trees, a figure, barely more than a shadow, retreating as soon as I tried to focus. I dismissed it as a trick of the fog, but Thomas's hand tightened on the reins. He had seen it too. Food was scant. We carried hardtack and dried meat, but the cold made eating difficult. Our water had frozen in a small cask, and the air, heavy with mist, left us perpetually damp. Our coats, thick as they were, seemed insufficient against the creeping cold that penetrated even to the bones. Sleep was impossible. Every snap of a branch, every distant rustle of animal or wind left our hearts hammering. We began to notice small signs that the road itself had changed. Branches were broken as if brushed aside, paw prints too large for any known animal pressed into mud, and the faintest impressions of claws against the wooden wheels. Nightfall brought a deeper terror. The moon, waning and pale, offered little light. Shadows stretched long across the road, reaching for us with limbs of twisted trees. Owls called at irregular intervals, and their hoots seemed interrupted by pauses that felt deliberate, as if something was listening, learning. The horses shied frequently, and Thomas spoke less. I caught him whispering to himself at times, counting steps or muttering prayers. At one particularly narrow stretch, with a road cut between two cliffs with a frozen stream below, the fog thickened until visibility dropped to mere feet. It was there that I first felt a presence, something at the periphery of my vision, moving against the grain of nature. I could not tell its size, only that it was not animal, not human, and yet it was intelligent. I did not know why I knew this. Perhaps instinct or the culmination of stories passed down, but the certainty of intelligence chilled me more than the cold ever could. We stopped briefly near a fallen oak, giving the horses a moment's respite. That was when I noticed the tracks. 3, 4, maybe 5 sets of massive paw prints following our path, but never straying from the shadows. Their arrangement suggested coordination, a pack moving with purpose. I had seen packs of wolves, yes, but these did not behave like wolves. The symmetry, the spacing, the almost deliberate avoidance of direct confrontation. They were hunting, yet in a way far more patient, calculating, and terrifying. Thomas finally broke the silence. "We should turn back," he said, voice low, almost pleading. "This road, it does not welcome us. We should wait for dawn and try the old ford. Safer paths. Surely safer." His words were tentative, hesitant to name the fear that pressed upon us. I could not disagree, but turning back seemed equally dangerous. Whatever lingered here did not allow retreat. It forced choice, forward or nothing. And so we pressed on. Each mile was measured not by distance, but by endurance, against cold, fatigue, and fear. I began to note every sound, every faint shift in fog density, every whisper of wind to the trees. The environment itself became a character in our ordeal, shaping our actions, dictating our pace, and reminding us constantly that we were intruders. Our journey was no longer about mail or parcels, but survival. Each rutted wheel mark, each distant howl, became a chapter in a story we did not want to write. By the time we reached a small, abandoned crossroads, I felt the oppressive weight of the land settle fully upon us. The fog swirled, low and thick, hiding the shapes of gnarled trees. We could not see the ground beneath our feet. The paw prints had multiplied here, crossing and recrossing the path as though deliberating. I could sense the gaze of unseen eyes in the shadows, tracking our every move, cataloging our fear. And yet, we had no choice but to continue. Stopping entirely felt like surrender, an invitation to whatever lingered in these ancient woods. It was then that I began to understand the nature of our terror. The hounds or spirits or cursed beasts were not merely hunting. They were teaching, observing, testing. Their intelligence surpassed that of any ordinary animal, and their patience was infinite. They were a fixture of this land, as old as the frontier itself, woven into the soil and mist. And we, 2 men unprepared for their cunning, were the newest intruders in a game that stretched across decades, perhaps centuries. That night, as we made camp beneath the hollowed trunk of a fallen tree, I could not shake the feeling that we were being circled, studied, and perhaps even judged. The fog pressed down, muffling all sound but the faint, irregular breathing of our horses. Every rustle beyond the firelight made me flinch. And all the while, I wrote these words in my journal by candlelight, knowing that documentation was the only anchor to sanity in a world that no longer made sense. We had survived the first night, but in doing so, I felt something change within me, a shift toward vigilance, suspicion, and a dread so palpable that it settled like ice in the chest. By dawn, I knew this journey would not end as others had. There was no simple path through these woods, no shortcut to safety, only the road, the fog, the cold, and the ever-present knowledge that eyes, unseen yet intelligent, were following our every step. The days that followed were measured less by sunlight and more by the rhythm of our fear. Each morning, the fog lingered longer than it should have, curling through the trees like the fingers of some unseen hand. Even the birds had vanished from these woods. Their songs were replaced by silence, so complete it pressed against my eardrums. Thomas and I moved cautiously, each step deliberate, as though our mere motion could provoke whatever haunted the road. Yet the path ahead refused to yield, and so we pressed forward, hearts tethered to hope but shackled by dread. It began with the tracks. Paw prints that seemed impossible in their size and symmetry appeared with alarming frequency. One morning, after we had camped near the ruins of a stone mill, I discovered a fresh set that had not been there the night before. They were wide, deep-clawed, almost human in proportion, yet undeniably animal, and they surrounded our camp in a perfect semicircle, stopping just beyond the reach of the firelight. I did not speak of it at first. Fear, I realized, is a delicate thing. Naming it aloud gives it power. Thomas noticed them before I could. "They watch," he said quietly, not daring to raise his voice. I felt it in that moment, the weight of invisible eyes upon us, the certainty that we were no longer alone in this wilderness. The forest had shifted subtly. Branches that had been upright the day before now sagged, as though recoiling from something. The wind, which had once whispered gently through the trees, carried now an undertone of menace, a low hum almost like a growl, yet too constant, too deliberate to be natural. We began to see signs beyond the tracks. Items in our camp moved slightly overnight, shifted in ways the wind could not explain. Hardtack was chewed, bark stripped from trees in peculiar patterns, and the horses became increasingly agitated, ears flat, eyes wide, trembling as if anticipating a predator that never struck in the daylight. At times, we thought we glimpsed shapes moving between trees, hulking shadows, quick and silent, vanishing whenever we tried to focus. And always, the fog clung more thickly in these moments, turning familiar paths into mazes of uncertainty. One afternoon, as we rested near a stream, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A single, massive paw print lay pressed into the soft mud. It was larger than any wolf I had ever seen, claws splayed, pads deeply indented, and beside it were faint marks, scored into the earth, not made by hooves, not by human feet, but something in between, a pattern of movement that suggested thought, intent, almost playfulness. I recoiled, half expecting the creature to appear from the woods behind us. Thomas said nothing, merely gripped the reins, white-knuckled, eyes darting to every dark corner. At night, the terror intensified. The hounds, or whatever they were, did not strike immediately. Instead, they prowled, their presence announced by sounds that defied explanation. Sometimes it was a low, rhythmic padding that circled the camp. Other times, it was a prolonged growl that rose and fell as though mocking us. I began to notice their intelligence. They seemed to toy with us, appearing in the periphery of our vision, vanishing when looked at directly, leaving traces, a broken branch, a paw print, a faint impression of claws on our supplies. The fog thickened as if in response to their proximity, hugging the earth and masking the movements of something unseen. The nights were worst of all. We huddled by a small fire, its warmth and light fragile against the oppressive darkness. I could feel them then, stalking just beyond the reach of the flames. The horses shivered violently, refusing to eat. Thomas muttered prayers under his breath, and I, too, found myself whispering, not knowing if the words carried meaning or were merely rituals to stave off madness. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of a branch, every sigh of the wind through hollow trunks, felt deliberate, intended to unnerve us. Once, I thought I heard a voice, a whisper, articulating some strange cadence, but the fog swallowed it before I could be sure. The days blurred into one another. Fatigue added its own terror, dulling judgment and sharpening every shadow. We began to talk less, speaking only when necessary, each word carefully measured. The world contracted to the road, the fog, the horses, and the unseen watchers. And yet, there were moments, fleeting, ephemeral, when the forest seemed almost normal. A bird would cry in the distance. A rabbit would dart across our path. Sunlight would touch the branches. In the rare moment, the mist parted. These brief glimpses of ordinary life felt cruel, as though the land were reminding us of what we had lost, what safety could be, just to deepen the fear when it was withdrawn again. Then there were the sounds, not just footsteps or growls, but things that made the air vibrate with unnatural resonance. A series of low, almost melodic howls that seemed to echo from all directions. The sound of nails scraping wood on the underside of the stagecoach, a soft panting that stopped whenever we froze. One evening, as dusk fell, the horses suddenly bolted without reason, nearly throwing us from the box. I gripped the reins, heart hammering, and Thomas swore under his breath. When we finally calmed the beasts, we noticed claw marks along the wheels, fresh, deep, deliberate. Whatever followed us was studying our methods of travel, learning, anticipating. As the fear mounted, our rationality began to fracture. Thomas became quiet, withdrawn, and restless, pacing near the horses even in the fog's embrace. I noticed small signs of paranoia in myself, checking behind constantly, starting at the smallest sound, flinching at the whisper of leaves. One morning, I awoke to find the camp shifted slightly. The fire was cold, our blankets rearranged and strange. Deep scratches etched into the trunk of the tree where we had rested. The marks were not human, not animal, and the precision suggested intelligence. I shivered. They were here, observing, cataloging, learning about us, the fragile newcomers who had wandered into their domain. Communication with each other became sparse. Words felt inadequate against the terror we faced. And yet our unspoken bond, the shared knowledge of what we had witnessed, kept us moving. We did not discuss turning back. There seemed no option. Retreat was not only dangerous, but perhaps impossible. The path behind us was indistinct. The forest seemingly altered. Branches had shifted, fog thickened in unnatural patches, and the paw prints multiplied, erasing signs we might have used to navigate. The world itself seemed hostile, aware, and unwilling to allow passage. One night, I swear I saw their eyes, pairs of luminous, amber gold glows reflecting in the mist, low to the ground, intelligent, watching unblinking. They held me in place with a gaze that seemed alive, assessing, judging. Thomas did not see them, or perhaps he dared not acknowledge them. I felt frozen, knowing instinctively that any sudden movement would invite attention, but remaining still did not ease the suffocating tension. The fog seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, each exhalation. I could not distinguish between reality and imagination. Perhaps the creatures thrived on that uncertainty. Perhaps they had always done so. It was here, in the days of ceaseless fog, the nights of stalking, the endless silent miles of road, that I began to understand. The hounds or spirits or curses or whatever these creatures were did not hunt like ordinary predators. They were patient. They understood strategy. They stalked not for immediate sustenance, but to instill fear, to bend the minds of those who entered their territory. The intelligence was subtle, pervasive, manifest in movements unseen, in timing, in the shaping of fog and shadow. And the deeper we traveled, the more obvious it became that we were the quarry, trapped not by walls or chains, but by knowledge of the hunt itself. By the 15th day, the road had become a living entity. Every noise, every shadow, every patch of fog was a message. Do not linger. The paw prints had begun to cross the path more boldly, leading and then vanishing, circling our camp, forcing us to abandon any sense of routine. We rationed food, water, and warmth carefully. Fear had become our constant companion, and sleep, when it came, was fitful, full of dreamlike images of hounds that moved too fast, too fluidly, to be captured by waking eyes. I began to write less, record less, fearing that even acknowledging their presence might draw it closer. And still, we moved forward, not for hope of reaching the next village, but because standing still was worse. Every step was a negotiation with dread, every breath a victory against despair. I began to notice subtle changes in the forest itself. Trees bent slightly away from the road, the fog thickened unnaturally around clearings, and distant echoes of sound would stop abruptly as if cut by unseen hands. Time became meaningless. The days, the nights, the fog, the forest, and the hounds merged into a single, suffocating entity that held us captive in a reality that had lost its rules. It was in this period that I first sensed that our journey would not end without confrontation. The intelligence behind the shadows, the deliberate nature of the stalking, the almost playful cruelty, it all suggested awareness, territory, and judgment. We were intruding on something ancient, something that had existed before roads, before settlements, before men like us walked these lands. And the deeper we traveled, the more palpable the presence became, until it felt as though the forest itself were alive, breathing around us, filled with eyes that would not blink. The nights grew unbearable. Sleep became a fragile, fleeting thing, snatched in fits between shivering bouts beside the horses. Each evening, as darkness settled like a suffocating cloak, the fog thickened into a wall that distorted distance, swallowing the road and swallowing our sense of direction. Thomas and I moved only when necessary, the horses skittish and jittery, sensing far more than we could name. We began to understand that the hounds, or spirits, or whatever they were patient predators, mastering silence and the art of stalking without revealing themselves outright. The first direct encounter came on a night so dense with fog, it seemed the world had dissolved into nothing but gray and shadow. We were crossing a narrow bridge over a frozen stream, the wooden planks slick with ice and frost. I felt it before I saw it, a shift in the air, a sudden coldness that made the hair on my arm stand stiff. The horses froze, ears flat, nostrils flaring. Then I caught the faintest movement at the edge of the fog, a hulking, low-slung shape gliding between the trees. Its eyes were a pair of dimly glowing amber, intelligent, unblinking. It did not charge. It did not howl. It simply watched, waiting, as though measuring our resolve. Thomas whispered, "It knows we're here. It knows everything." His voice was strained, tense with disbelief and terror. I did not argue. The creature's patience, its silent observation, was far more terrifying than immediate violence. We passed the bridge without incident, but the memory of those eyes lingered. I felt exposed, naked, a fragile intruder in a world that had not seen men for generations. That night, I wrote little in my journal, fearing that even acknowledgement might draw attention. The next morning, evidence of our stalkers became undeniable. The path ahead was littered with marks, gouges in the wood of fallen branches, deep indentations of mud, and paw prints that had grown even larger. Some of them followed the road. Some diverged into the forest, always returning, as though the hounds were testing boundaries. We discovered a torn scrap of cloth from the stagecoach lying snagged on a branch, cleanly cut, as though inspected before being discarded. The intelligence of these beings was deliberate and cruel. Every step we took was catalogued, every misstep noted. By the fourth night of our journey, the creatures became bolder. Sounds echoed unnaturally, footsteps approaching the camp in irregular rhythms, sometimes slow, sometimes rapid, yet no figure revealed itself fully. Once, we awoke to find the horses trembling violently, reins twisted and claw marks deep in the frozen earth around them. The fog had thickened, and I thought I could hear whispers in it, though whether wind or imagination I could not tell. Thomas refused to speak of it, eyes hollow, body taut with tension. We were exhausted, but moving meant survival. Stopping meant surrender. Our sense of time fractured further. Days became loops of fog, mud, and distant, unplaceable howls. Occasionally, shapes, elongated and almost humanoid, would dart between the trees at the periphery of vision, vanishing when focused on directly. The hounds were shaping our perception of reality. Each movement, each sound, each shift in fog felt engineered to wear us down psychologically. They were no longer mere creatures. They were sentinels of the forest, manipulating the environment to their advantage, turning the land itself into a weapon against us. I noticed patterns. They seemed to patrol in intervals, circling our path, approaching at dusk and withdrawing at dawn, always just beyond sight. Sometimes their presence was indicated only by the sudden freezing of our horses, the shifting fog, or the faint scrape of claws on wood or stone. One night, as we camped near the remnants of an old stone bridge, we counted 6 sets of paw prints forming a perfect semicircle around our fire. Not attacking, not hunting in the usual sense, merely observing. They were intelligent, deliberate, calculating every move. And I began to sense a hierarchy, as though some unseen leader directed their actions. Thomas began speaking less, And when he did, his voice was haunted, his words fragmented. We should not be here. They know our thoughts. The road, it moves with them. I could not deny the sensation. I felt watched even when standing still, the fog parting to reveal brief glimpses of movement just beyond the light. Each glance confirmed nothing, yet suggested everything. Sleep became impossible. Even brief naps brought dreams of glowing eyes, circling forms, and the sensation of being dragged into fog by unseen jaws. The boundary between waking and dreaming blurred. One night, we attempted a small strategy. We changed direction abruptly, leaving a false trail to mislead whatever followed. For hours, we moved silently, eyes forward, hearts hammering. Yet when we paused, the paw prints were there, as if the hounds had anticipated us. They were not merely following. They were studying, predicting, waiting for an opportune moment. It was not fear of attack alone that kept us moving. It was fear of discovery, exposure, of miscalculating and becoming permanent prey. The nights grew colder still, a frost a bit deeper than mere air, and the fog thickened into a viscous presence that seemed almost alive. Occasionally, a figure or a suggestion of one would appear at the edge of our vision, massive, low to the ground, sometimes a faint shimmer as if made of mist itself. The horses reacted violently, rearing, snorting, trembling. We learned to move slowly, deliberately, anticipating the unseen. Each mile became a negotiation with terror. Each sound a signal that some unseen intelligence was at work. At times, I imagined we were not merely being hunted, but tested. Their patience suggested an understanding of human psychology, of anticipation, of fear itself. The hounds were not driven by hunger or instinct alone. They seemed to thrive on dread, shaping the fog, the shadows, and even the weather to heighten the mind's susceptibility to panic. Each step, each pause, each flinch was observed, catalogued. I began to feel that survival depended not on speed or strength, but on maintaining composure in a landscape designed to strip it from us. One night, as we paused a small clearing, Thomas finally spoke. I think they're learning us. They know how we think, how we react. His eyes were wide, reflecting the pale glow of the moon through the fog. I nodded, knowing he was right. Each night, we noticed new traces of intelligence. Patterns in how the fog drifted, subtle arrangements of broken branches, paw prints forming deliberate lines, almost communicating. They were teaching us, forcing us into patterns of fear we could not escape. I began to write less, record less, fearing that acknowledgement might draw attention. Yet I could not stop observing. Each detail mattered. The paw prints became more complex, some intersecting our path and vanishing mysteriously, others forming arcs that led us to places previously unnoticed. The intelligence behind these movements was undeniable, deliberate, and unnerving. We had trespassed into a realm that had its own rules, and the hounds were its guardians. By the end of this week, exhaustion had begun to erode our resolve. Our hands were raw from gripping the reins, our eyes strained from constant vigilance, our bodies chilled from the ceaseless fog. Even food became a burden, a necessity we struggled to maintain. Yet despite all this, we pressed onward. Retreat seemed impossible. The land had already rejected any thought of turning back. And somewhere in the suffocating fog and the deep silence punctuated by ghostly howls, I understood fully. The hounds were patient, cunning, and aware, and we were running out of time before they revealed themselves in a manner from which there would be no return. The forest had changed completely by the time we reached the clearing near the ruins of Old Hollow Mill. The fog was thicker than ever, a gray tide that obscured even shapes a few feet ahead. I could feel the presence before I saw it, an oppressive weight pressing on the senses, a subtle vibration in the air, like the forest itself was alive and aware. The horses shivered violently, refusing to move, ears flat, tails bristling. Thomas and I exchanged a glance, knowing that the culmination of days of terror had arrived. The watchers had grown impatient. It began subtly, a shift in the fog, a movement too smooth and silent to belong to a normal animal. Then the amber glows appeared, dozens of them, scattered, unblinking, hovering at the edges of visibility. They were low to the ground, massive, but not monstrous in the way our imaginations had made them. There was a predatory intelligence in those eyes, a deliberate assessment of our fear. They did not rush or charge. They observed. They stalked with a patience that made hours feel like days. I saw a shape more clearly than I had dared to before. It moved through the mist with impossible fluidity, muscles coiled and eyes calculating. Its size was larger than any dog, limbs longer, head low, ears flat against a skull that seemed almost humanoid in structure. Yet it was not human. It was something that had existed in the shadows long before men had named beasts. I caught a glimpse of a second figure, then a third, moving in tandem, circling, vanishing, always just beyond perception. Each motion was purposeful, almost ritualistic. They were not hunting blindly. They were orchestrating, testing our reactions, reading our thoughts. Thomas whispered, voice trembling, They know us." I nodded, unable to speak, because the certainty of his words was undeniable. Each flicker of movement, every pause, each rustle of branches was deliberate. It was as though the hounds were measuring our courage, our exhaustion, our will to continue. And I began to understand that this was more than survival. This was judgment. The creatures did not need to attack to terrify. Their presence alone, the deliberate unfolding of their observation, was punishment enough. The fog shifted, and I thought I saw forms almost human in posture, standing briefly, then dropping to all fours as the light caught their outlines. They were silent, yet I could feel their awareness in every nerve of my body. Their territory was not merely the road. It was the forest itself, the fog, the shadows, the very air. Every detail had been claimed, every movement watched. We were intruders, and they were guardians of a world we had only dared glimpse in folklore. Their intelligence was subtle, terrifying in its patience, and it became impossible to distinguish between natural and supernatural. The forest had become a living trap, orchestrated by minds we could not understand. Then came the sound. Low, layered growls, not random but rhythmic, intelligent, almost like a language of intimidation. One hound stepped from the shadows, its eyes reflecting the pale light, muscles coiled in readiness, yet it did not move closer. It tilted its head, as though considering us, weighing us, then withdrew slightly. Another mirrored the motion, and then another. There was coordination, strategy, hierarchy. We were being confronted, but not in the way ordinary hunters confront prey. It was a demonstration, a revelation of power and intelligence without a single act of physical violence. Thomas's hands were shaking on the reins. We cannot stay," he said, voice taut with fear. I agreed silently. Every instinct screamed that this encounter was a warning, not yet an attack, and that prolonging our presence could be fatal. Yet the creatures did not pursue immediately. They maintained distance, keeping us aware of their awareness. It was as though they wanted us to understand our position fully before acting. The knowledge that they could strike, that they could annihilate us in moments if they chose, was a weight heavier than any physical threat. I dared to glance back down the road. The tracks we had followed for days now radiated outward, intersecting and curling in complex patterns. Paw prints, claw marks, subtle disturbances in the fog indicated movements too clever to be random. The hounds had rewritten the path itself, reshaped it to test us. Each footfall was catalogued, each hesitation recorded. I realized then that we had been observed from the moment we left the bridge. Every action, every fear, every breath had been noted, manipulated. The forest was alive with their intelligence. And yet, the revelation was incomplete. We did not see them fully, did not see their faces, their forms in detail. It was as if full sight would overwhelm the mind. The glimpses we received were enough to instill terror, to communicate dominion, but deliberately incomplete. I felt that they existed simultaneously in the visible and invisible, partly ghosts, partly flesh, partly the forest itself. They were guardians, predators, and judges, and we were on trial. The first howl came at dawn, soft and deliberate, rising from the mist in layers of sound. I felt it resonate in my chest, a vibration that spoke to something primal and ancient. The hounds were announcing their presence to the world, asserting control, yet refraining from immediate attack. The intelligence behind the sound was undeniable. It was calculated to unnerve, to establish authority. to remind us of our vulnerability. I did not flinch, though my body screamed to do so. Each movement now carried consequence. Thomas finally spoke, barely audible. "We must move carefully, keep distance." His words were fragmented, but his meaning was clear. We both understood. The revelation we had just witnessed was a test. Any misstep could be fatal. Yet the creatures did not pursue. They allowed us to remain, to observe, to comprehend. It was as though understanding our role in their world was part of the trial itself. Their intelligence was terrifying precisely because it was invisible, subtle, omnipresent. They were not beasts to fight. They were forces of the land, patient and deliberate. As we moved forward through the mist, eyes straining for the shapes that seemed to flicker at the edges of perception, I wrote what I could in my journal. My hands trembled, not from cold alone, but from the awareness that we had glimpsed something beyond comprehension, something ancient, something intelligent, something that claimed these roads as its own and measured every human intruder with precision and patience. It was not merely survival we sought now. It was understanding how little we truly belonged. By midday, the fog thinned slightly, revealing glimpses of the road ahead and the twisted trees that lined it. And yet, I could feel the presence behind us, always just beyond vision. Every step, every glance, every decision was observed. The creatures did not need to attack to control us. Their intelligence, their awareness, and their dominance over this land was punishment enough. They were spectral guardians, embodiments of fear and folklore, and we were fragile trespassers who had wandered too far into the territory of the unknown. The moment came without warning. We had been moving cautiously through the fog, alert, hearts hammering, when a sudden, low rumble rolled through the forest like the earth itself had growled. The horses reared, kicking against the icy ground, and a chorus of sharp, echoing howls erupted from the mist around us. The hounds had chosen to reveal their full presence, and their patience had ended. I barely managed to rein in the terrified beasts, heart thundering in my chest. Eyes glowed like molten amber, reflecting in the fog, appearing suddenly at every turn of the road. Their forms were massive, hulking, and yet still partially hidden in shadow. I could feel the intelligence behind them, calculating, anticipating. They had learned our movements, our pauses, our instincts. Every attempt to flee was met with strategy, not brute force. Thomas yelled, voice cracking, "Forward! Don't stop!" And the horses surged over the rutted trail, hooves slamming against frozen mud. The fog whipped past like a living thing, carrying the scent of sulfur and decay. Every step brought us closer to the edge of exhaustion. Every sound, branches snapping, paws striking earth, low growls, piercing the night like blades. I dare not look behind, but I could feel them in my mind, circling, stalking, closing the distance with uncanny speed. Branches clawed at our coats, sharp and relentless. I felt the brush of her against my arm, or perhaps it was a wind, but there was no doubt in my mind that something moved with us, keeping pace. A sudden roar shattered the night, deafening, vibrating through my bones. The horses faltered, skidding across the icy trail. I whipped them forward, urging them onward with desperation clawing at every nerve. The trees blurred past, skeletal fingers reaching for us. Shadows seemed to move independently of the fog, shapes slipping into vision at impossible angles, vanishing when focused upon. My mind teetered between fear and instinctual clarity. Every decision mattered. A wrong turn, a hesitation, a faltering heartbeat could be the end. The hounds were patient hunters, but they were also relentless. I understood then that escape required not speed alone, but cunning, courage, and endurance beyond what I had imagined possible. The roar came again, closer now, accompanied by the sound of pounding paws striking earth, branches, and stone. The fog thickened suddenly, suffocating, blinding, as if the forest itself sought to claim us. Thomas's breathing was ragged, and the horses shivered violently under our weight. I clutched the reins, urging them over a small rise, heart pounding. At the crest, the moonlight broke through the fog briefly, and I caught the glimmer of their eyes, multiple pairs, watching, calculating, anticipating. The chase continued relentlessly. Every twist of the road, Every dip into the icy mud, every snap of a branch sent pulses of adrenaline through my body. I could hear the low growls around us, interspersed with higher, keening howls that pierced the night and chilled the marrow. The creatures were no longer merely shadows. They were tangible threats, yet still elusively hidden. Their forms suggested more than seen, as though they existed between dimensions of reality and nightmare. At one point, a branch snapped beneath a paw too close for comfort, and one of the hounds lunged into view, massive and coiled like a spring, eyes locked on us. The horses bolted, slipping and skidding on the icy trail, Thomas's shouts mingling with my own. The roar followed, echoing, reverberating across the trees, and I realized with a sickening certainty that the hounds were not hunting in frenzy. They were orchestrating, manipulating our path, guiding us toward a narrowing corridor of forest that left no room for hesitation. Then, as if the fog itself had parted to reveal a single narrow trail, we saw it. The old bridge near the edge of the northern gorge, worn and trembling under ice. It was a gamble, the only chance we had. Thomas urged the horses forward, and I followed, gripping the reins until my fingers burned. The hounds closed in, their amber eyes reflecting in the thin moonlight, but the narrow bridge forced them to hesitate. Their roar, the sound of paws striking earth, and the mist curling around their forms created an almost tactile sense of pressure, a weight on the chest that made breathing laborious. We crossed. Every step was agony, every second a fight against collapse. Behind us, the sound of pursuit faltered, then diminished, leaving only the echo of distant howls and the lingering menace in the fog. When we finally reached the far side, hearts hammering, lungs burning, and frost biting through layers of clothing, the presence receded slightly. We dared not stop to look back, but I knew the hounds had not abandoned us. They had allowed our escape for now, but the forest had marked us. Their intelligence, their patience, their cruelty, these remained, invisible yet omnipresent, a lingering shadow on the edges of memory and reality. By dawn, exhausted and trembling, we pressed onward, neither speaking nor daring to pause. The chase had ended, yet the weight of their observation remained. The road, the forest, the fog, the distant growls, they were all imprinted in our minds, a permanent mark. The hounds had shown themselves, and in doing so, had altered the way we perceived every tree, every shadow, every whisper of wind. The terror would not fade with distance. It would follow, quiet and patient, waiting for the moment to reassert dominion. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the thinning fog, Thomas and I had reached the outskirts of the old frontier settlement. The familiar shapes of weathered cottages, smoke curling from chimneys, and the distant clatter of early morning activity felt almost surreal after nights of relentless pursuit. Our horses stumbled under exhaustion, legs trembling, nostrils flaring, yet they carried us forward until we finally slowed on a solid, clear stretch of road. We did not speak. Words were unnecessary, inadequate even. The terror we had endured pressed between us like a living thing, one that had no intention of letting go. I could still see the amber glows in the corners of my vision, fleeting reflections in puddles and dewdrops, remnants of the forest guardians watching, waiting. The paw prints in the mud, the gouges in the wood, the subtle manipulation of fog and shadow, all remained etched into my mind. They had allowed us to survive, but I knew instinctively it was not mercy, only judgment deferred. Thomas finally broke the silence with a whisper, voice hoarse. We should leave this place, never speak of it. I nodded, knowing he was right. No tale could capture what we had witnessed, and none would believe the precision, the patience, the intelligence of the things that had stalked us. Even now, days later, the memory lingers, a subtle sense of being watched, the faintest echo of distant howls, a shiver at the periphery of sight. We reached the inn at the settlement, the first warm shelter in days. The familiar smells of hearth smoke, cooked meat, and human presence should have been comforting, but they only reminded me of how fragile our survival had been. I left the horses in the stable, hands shaking, and sat by the fire in silence, aware that the forest and its guardians were far behind, but never truly gone. I write this now in the safety of ink and paper, hoping to preserve memory, to make sense of events that defy reason. The hounds, the fog, the shadows, they are not mere beasts, not tales to frighten children. They are patient, intelligent, territorial, and eternal. I survived, but the forest marked me. Every road, every shadowed path, every quiet night reminds me that the frontier holds its guardian still. They are always watching, and I know, somewhere in the mist, they wait for the next trespasser. Some part of me wonders if we truly escaped, or if we are merely living on borrowed time, constantly observed by eyes that will not rest. Fear lingers in ways that daylight cannot chase away. And so I write, because memory is the only defense I have, the only record that such things walked these roads in 1841, and that perhaps they still do